Check, check, check. 1, 2. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Hey, 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 1, 1. Oh, that's the wrong thing. 1, 2, 1, 2.
Erev Tov, everyone. I guess technically still Shabbat Shalom. Thank you all for being here at the beginning of our commemoration of Tisha B'Av. As I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about, it actually kind of became a joke in the office because people would continually ask me, what are you going to teach for Tisha B'Av? And I kept saying, I haven't thought of it yet. But then at Kiddush a couple weeks ago, I was talking with somebody who had mentioned that they had been in Israel for Tisha B'Av, specifically at the Kotel, at the Western Wall, which I haven't actually been for Tisha B'Av, so I was very interested to hear what that experience was like for them. But it was also interesting because the language that they used was, I was at the Kotel and I saw all these people boo-hoo-hooing. And I thought that was a really interesting language to use because, of course, for the people who were there, they were having a very powerful emotional experience. And it seemed like that language was sort of a distancing effect. Because, of course, Tisha B'Av is the saddest day on the Jewish year. And there are many holidays in our cycle that are associated with having specific feelings, joy on Purim, and self-reflection in the holidays. And it's pretty clear that Tisha B'Av, you're supposed to feel sadness and grief over the destructions of the first temple and the second temple, over many other historical tragedies that have been inflicted on the Jewish people. And yet, I think people can be very reluctant to actually engage with those feelings for understandable reasons, and distancing is one of the ways to make it seem more palatable. But in fact, it's, I think, diving into these emotions that makes the day really strike a chord, and particularly when it comes to crying or boo-hoo-hooing. There's lots of reasons why people cry. And so to start out, and we have a microphone runner, I just want people to raise your hand and throw out some reasons of why people cry. Why do people cry? Yeah, give an example.
With the tragedy of last week, losing two women, there's reason to cry.
Yes, when, of course, that terrible attack happened in this city, even people who didn't know the victims personally were struck by just the sheer sadness of it. And so, sadness and grief causes that emotional reflex and can cause people to cry. Great. What other reasons might there be for people to cry? Oh, okay, another one. Great.
When I think about all these soldiers that have died, 850 maybe by now, and a lot of them are in their 30s and have 2, 3, maybe 4 and more children, and all the orphans. It's a real tragedy.
Yeah, and what you're seeing is, I think, not only the loss of life, and we cherish life so much in Judaism, but also similarly the loss of a potential future, the loss of time with their parent or what they could have done as well. Grief and loss are so interconnected. Another example, Mark.
There were both tears of joy and tears of sorrow. Nothing exemplified it more in my life than when we were just leaving Israel during the war. And we were on a boat heading to Cyprus. And the captain called me to the deck, and I looked out, and I saw the lights of Cyprus, and it just was such an emotional thing that I was so happy and joyful that we're finally safe. But then I made a 180-degree turn, and I looked in the opposite direction and literally saw missiles being shot out over the sky over Haifa. Wow. And this brought tears of joy, tears of sadness. So both ends of the spectrum, of the emotional spectrum, are exemplified by tears.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think relief is one of the feelings, gratitude for your own personal safety, and then recognizing that not everybody has the privileges that you're experiencing in that moment. Let's take one more example of why people might cry. Yeah, Rabbi Zosmer.
Sometimes people cry when they're angry.
Yeah, just frustration, and it just builds up, and the tears offer a release. I thought people were going to say, the sort of what's called reflex tears, like if smoke gets in your eyes or you're chopping onions, right? Those are also the tears. It's the same process of tears as it is for anything else, but that's more about keeping your eye lubricated, and of course, actually the tear ducts are constantly processing in order to keep our eyes healthy. But the main reason that we think about crying is because it's about a release of emotion in one way or another. And we know that it releases endorphins and activates parts of our parasympathetic nervous system as a way to flush out the feelings that we have, allow them to come forward. And so actually it's fitting particularly to talk about it in the context of Eicha, the book of our Bible that we're going to be reading, because the second verse in the whole collection talks about the tears that happened during the destruction of the temple. In our tradition, the book of Eicha was written by Jeremiah, who personally witnessed the destruction of the first temple. And you can see at the beginning of page 1 of your packet, the second verse of Eicha. If you're joining us by live stream, you can find this source sheet at pasyn.org/sermon teaching. And so the second verse is she in Eicha is the city of Jerusalem. She cries, crying in the night, her cheek wet with tears. There is none to comfort her of all her friends. All her allies have betrayed her. They have become her foes. So what I like to do in the Talmud class that we teach is whenever we see a verse that has possibly multiple interpretations or questions that we might not know, we put ourselves in the positions of the rabbis in the Talmud, and ask questions. And especially with something like Eicha, which is poetry, anyone who remembers English class remembers that poetry really lends itself to analysis and a lot of different interpretations. So just looking at this verse from Eicha, what questions do you have about why the author used this language and not other language? What's jumping out at you as something that's interesting or confusing or something that you think the rabbis might want to delve in further before actually seeing in the non-bolded text what the rabbis actually did? Let's see what ideas you had. Yeah, please wait for the microphone and then go ahead.
The first thing that strikes me is she, which I think is unusual.
Yes, right. We'll see this throughout the book, that Jerusalem is referred to as in feminine language. Of course, Hebrew is a gendered language, and so all common nouns do have a gendered component, but it's a particular choice to refer to Jerusalem as a woman, particularly a woman in the context of war and conquest. And so one question that actually there's been a lot of writing on is about why that language, why she as the pronoun. Great. Other questions, other things that jumped out at people? Yeah, Michael.
Crying. The double use there almost reminds you of Zedek Sedan. You're not. Like, why do we need to see the two cry twice? Like, why
Yeah, if you look at the Hebrew, the first two words are bacho tivche, which are two different ways to say the word, the verb to cry. And so this English translation is cries, crying. You see that in a lot of other places in the Tanakh. They'll use two verbs in slightly different, one after the other, as some point of emphasis. But of course, the question always is, why use two words when you could just as easily use one? So there's something interesting going on about the crying, which may lend itself to further analysis. Yeah. Other things that jump out at people. Yes, please.
The point about all the betrayal, that feels particularly pertinent with the way that so many particularly non-Jewish people reacted after October 7th. There was a lot of betrayal after that.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I think one of the powerful things about Eicha is we come back to it every year, and the context in which we read it really is reflected by our own personal experience in the past year. And I think you're right that a lot of Jewish people have felt betrayed by their friends and their allies, or putative friends and allies, that we may feel that we were there for other people in their time of need, and that feeling hasn't been reciprocated. This certainly seems to have been the feeling among the Jewish people at the time the first temple was destroyed as well, that Jerusalem, or the citizens of Jerusalem, of the Jewish people, feel isolated and alone. And not only that, but the people that were their friends have become their foes. Yeah. So there's lots of other directions that we can go, but I want to go to Michael's question, or actually the rabbis in the Talmud went to this question of why the emphasis when talking about crying. And the answer you can see from Rabbi Yochanan in the third box. Why does it say crying twice? Well, one was crying over the first temple, and the other crying was crying over the second temple. Even though this was written to describe the first temple, they knew that the second temple would be destroyed, and therefore that's the other crying that's there. So of course, just because a rabbi said it, even someone as illustrious as Rabbi Yochanan, doesn't necessarily mean that they're right. So the question that I'll ask you is, do you buy this as an analysis, or is there another interpretation, because this is the only one that's recorded in the Talmud, is there another reason that you might think of why it says cry twice? Yeah, please.
So it's sort of like the way in English we would say weeping and wailing. It could just be a phrase where we're using two aspects of the same action.
Yeah, and that's very common in biblical poetry too. But of course, when you say weeping and wailing, it's an emphasis, it's an escalator, right? There's crying and then there's crying. So whatever this is an incredibly intense expression of emotion. So of course, the destruction of the temple, where all of the ritual sacrifices, it was the center of Jewish religious life. It was also the center of Jewish social life, because everybody would gather 3 times a year, at least, for the major pilgrimage holidays. All of that's gone. It makes sense that the crying would be escalated more than something that wasn't as serious. Yeah, Joan.
Also, sometimes the repetition intensifies the horror of certain things, and I think that that's true here too.
Yeah, exactly. It's an intensification. And then the next clause in the verse that they talk about is crying in the night. One would imagine that the crying extended not just in the night, but also through the day. And so the rabbis ask, first we analyze why crying, and now we analyze why in the night. And the first answer, actually, before we get to the first answer, does anyone have any ideas of why they might be talking about the night in particular as a time that people might cry?
I was just thinking that this reminds me a little bit of the Seder and the Haggadah, and when we're reading the story of Exodus, they talk about not just the days, but all the days, and then the various rabbis interpret it as, okay, well, all the days means the days and the nights. Mm-hmm. So I thought there's sort of an interesting parallel there. Right,
yeah. I mean, the rabbis do like to cover all of their bases and make sure that they're very clear about when things are happening, and so this makes clear that it wasn't just, most battles in ancient times took place mostly in the day just because they didn't have the lighting to do it at night. But this is showing that this was a continuous mourning process, not just in the immediate time that this is happening.
I think that you feel more vulnerable at night, more alone, and where things could be more difficult to process.
Yeah, I see some nods in the room that night is a time of increased vulnerability. There's many different reasons I can think. I mean, certainly before electricity, it was very dark, and that can be isolating and scary. Also, it's the time that you're sort of wrapping up your day, and before you go to sleep, all you really have are your thoughts, right? And sometimes it can be very scary or emotional to just be sitting in it. Please, Dana, go ahead.
The night's quiet, and so when you cry out, putting the cried part aside, the tears cried, but when you cry out, when you yell at night, it's really an effort to be heard in a way that you aren't heard necessarily during the day.
Yes. I mean, especially if you've ever spent time, out in the country, the sounds go very, very much farther, right? And so you hear it at night, it becomes quite a shocking thing, and it can be an effort at reaching out, at hoping that somebody can hear you. Precisely so. So we'll get to some other possibilities, but the first reason why it says in the night is that it actually ties to the verse in the book of Numbers that talks about the aftermath of when the spies came back from scouting out the land of Israel, and the 10 of the 12 spies had reported that this is going to be an impossible task. There's giants living there. There's no way that we can take the land of Israel. And when the community heard this, according to the Torah, the whole community broke into loud cries, and the people wept that night. And according to, again, Rabbi Yochanan, that night on the calendar was Tisha B'Av. And so the Blessed Holy One, God said to Israel, "You cried a baseless cry, and so I will establish for you a cry for generations. You thought you had reason to cry then, I'm going to make you cry for real now." So it's interesting to see this, because this is actually sort of changing the Jewish history timeline, that the first tragedy on Tisha B'Av wasn't the destruction of the first temple. According to this interpretation from Rabbi Yochanan, at least, the first tragedy was believing the spies that God would not help the Jewish people enter the land of Israel. Does that change anything about how we understand Tisha B'Av? Yeah, please, go ahead.
When I've done some reading of Chofetz Chaim, which is about the sin of Lashon Hara, negative speech, and it talked about how the sin the main sin that destroyed at least the second temple was Lashon Hara, was bad talk amongst the Jewish community, and also how the spies giving wrong information, discouraging information about the land of Israel was also Lashon Hara. So it does make that connection between those two fatal sins, and it also draws connection of how the snake in the Garden of Eden was Lashon Hara, so it really drives home how big of a sin that is.
Right, exactly so. And I think it's an example that Lashon Hara doesn't necessarily have to be lying. It doesn't have to be making stuff up. It is true that the spies saw these giants, and it did seem very scary to them. The Lashon Hara in that case was not that they weren't telling the truth, is that they were just using speech in an inappropriate way, because in their case, it wasn't expressing any confidence the way that Joshua and Caleb did, that God would help them through in the end. And in fact, we can tie it even further, because the Hebrew term for why the second temple was destroyed, does anyone know the Hebrew term for it? Yeah. Sinat chinam. Sinat chinam, which means baseless hatred. And so what our understanding of in Jewish tradition is that the reason the second temple was destroyed is because within the Jewish people, or between one Jew and another Jew, there was baseless hatred between one and another. And that became so bad and so toxic that God felt that there needed to be a reset that led to the dispersion of the Jewish people. A very obviously serious consequence for what we know in Judaism that treats speech so seriously to be a very serious problem, this baseless hatred. And you can actually see a parallel if you look at the Hebrew in God saying, "You cried a baseless cry," because the Hebrew for the baseless cry is b'chiyah shel chinam. Chinam, the same word or same part of the phrase as sinat chinam. That there was no reason for the Israelites to have freaked out, just as there was no reason for the Jewish people living in Jerusalem in the year 70 to have been so hateful one to another. And equally there, it led to calamity for the Jewish people, because most of the people had to die and not enter the land of Israel. And in the year 70, it also led to a calamity in the destruction of the second temple and the exiling to the four corners of the world. Very good. So that is one reason for why we're talking about night, is they try to tie in this thing about the spies, which they believe also happens at night. That's more of the history lesson. But there's other things happening too that you'll see in the other interpretations. By the way, if you're in reading, especially Midrash, but also sometimes Talmud, when you see the Hebrew Devar Acher, which means another interpretation, the rabbis are throwing everything they can at the wall in order to see that something sticks. And what that means is that they're not quite satisfied with one answer, at least there isn't one answer that has become the sort of generally accepted opinion, But I think what that means is just as we can take so many different lessons from Tisha B'Av, so too we can take so many lessons from just this one word, Balayla, in the night. And so now we're talking in the other interpretations, anyone who cries at night, his voice is heard. It's just easier to hear sounds at night than during the hustle and bustle of the day. Another interpretation, anyone who cries at night, the stars and constellations cry with them. Anyone who cries at night, the one who hears their voice cries with them. The stars and constellations, I'm not really sure where that comes from. I couldn't really figure out where, and from any commentaries, why exactly the stars and constellations are crying. So if anyone has an idea, I'd love to hear it. But I think the one that's most interesting is anyone who cries at night, the one that hears their voice cries with them. Does that ring true to people? That if you hear a cry in the night, that will lead you to have a similar emotion? I saw a nod. Why do you think that is? Empathy. That's right. Yeah. I mean, especially if we talked about the night being a vulnerable time, one would hope at least that our response would be an empathetic one, and lead us to feel, if not the exact same feeling, then similar ones as well. And in fact, we'll have a story that comes here about Rabban Gamliel and where empathy goes. And it's actually a good thing that Rabban Gamliel is the rabbi in question here, because Rabban Gamliel was a very rich person and a political leader of the Jewish people. We also know from several other stories that he had a really big ego to match his wealth. So with many things with Rabban Gamliel, just because he's a rabbi in the Talmud, sometimes it means it's a good thing to do, and sometimes it's not a good thing to do. So let's read this story and see which way it goes. There's an incident involving one woman who was the neighbor of Rabban Gamliel, and this woman's son died, and she would cry over him at night. Rabban Gamliel heard her voice and cried with her until his eyelashes fell out. The next day, his students noticed and removed her from his neighborhood. And that's the entire story. So with every narrative, with every what's called in Hebrew agadah, something that isn't specifically halacha, that isn't specifically Jewish law, any story that's in the Talmud, the first question is, they didn't have to put any stories in the Talmud. It could have just been the laws, but they kept this story for some reason. And so the question always is, why? What is the reason when we're talking about empathy and we're talking about Tisha B'Av? What are we supposed to learn from this story of Rabban Gamliel and his neighbor? Yeah, go ahead.
I think back to the point of empathy. Back to the point of empathy. Sometimes people, including the majority, don't have empathy and will just remove whatever's making them uncomfortable. And to be empathetic, we have to be with the people in mourning and support them, as many of our Jewish mourning practices have. And you said at the beginning, a lot of people distance themselves from the painful emotions of today, and maybe that's not such a good thing to do. Maybe we do have to kind of really come together in those emotions.
Right. So in that reading of the story, Rabban Gamliel is doing the right thing, and or at least his students are doing the wrong thing, because they're removing the impediment to going about their normal business. They're trying to make things maybe better for their rabbi, and they kick this woman or remove her from the neighborhood, and we're assuming that this is not something that we should be learning from. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Are there other readings here of why this story is here? Yes, please.
I'm not sure, but maybe the students felt that it was sapping all his energy and all his knowledge, and he couldn't come forward to them to teach them what they needed to know.
Right. I mean, we talk about how important learning Torah and studying Torah is. Rabban Gamliel has a very important job as a leader and as a teacher, and it seems like, according to this interpretation, he was so paralyzed by this empathy that all he could do is cry and cry and cry. And that, while it may have been helpful for the woman, it was not helpful for other people who needed him to, be strong and be the teacher that they needed. So according to that interpretation, one of the lessons from Tisha B'Av could be it's important to, of course, share empathy for people, but perhaps there's also a limit to grief and empathy. I mean, there's a reason that Shiva lasts 7 days and not, and then it sort of de-escalates at the 30 days and then de-escalates at the year mark. If we were to continue to be in that state of mourning forever, eventually we would get worn out and wouldn't be able to live life the way it was meant to live. Tisha B'Av is it's a very important day, but it's also one day. We can't live every day like it's Tisha B'Av. Yes, other interpretations. Michael.
I would take it more, almost as grief is difficult. And so perhaps Rabbi Gamliel took it as empathizing, and his students wanted to do basically the easy way out. The fact of, look, I don't want to have to, deal with this sad situation, so let's just remove ourselves from it. And they're both valid emotional statements. I'm not necessarily condoning what a student did, but I'm not necessarily negatively judging them for it, because grief is hard.
Right. Yeah, and grief is hard and grief is unpredictable. And sometimes, just for the sake of being able to go about your life, you need to be able to put up a barrier and say, I can't deal with this now. Not that I'm never going to deal with it, but I need to have some sort of boundary that I set. So you could read this as being that the students were setting a boundary, that that they needed to have some sort of regularity in how they engaged with their empathy. Yeah, in the back, please.
Could it be that perhaps he needed to be removed so that he could help the woman more by distancing himself a little bit and getting a different perspective?
Yeah, I think that's a great reading. I mean, Rabban Gamliel seems very upset by this woman. We don't know what neighbor means. We don't know how close their relationship is, but it's clear that he is really, really engaged in this grief alongside her. And as commendable as that might be, he also may have lost a little bit of objectivity and a little bit of distance. And if you're in a position of care towards somebody, whether you're helping them in, for example, helping them through grief, you need to, it is helpful to have a little bit of emotional distance so that you can have the strength to pull them up if they need help getting up, so that you can take care of the logistics of Shiva so that they don't have to think about that stuff themselves. And so maybe that, in some cases, that can be the kindest thing of all, is making sure that you're not so caught up in your friend's devastation that you can't be fully supportive of them. I think we don't know for sure. These are all great interpretations. I think that's a terrific one. Anyone who we haven't heard from yet? Cantor Davis.
It makes me think about the state of the world as it is right now, because because of the internet, we know what's going on in the world at all times, and it's hard to feel empathy all the time because then you get exhausted. So you have to take care of yourself, and you have to remove yourself from the situation because you can't pour from an empty cup.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I've also heard people say, put on your own oxygen mask before assisting others. I think particularly in the age of the internet, one of the advantages of it is it allows us to feel closer to people, all over the world whom we wouldn't have otherwise heard their stories, and particularly when it comes to issues that affect the Jewish community or attacks that affect the Jewish community. To have that connection through social media allows us to feel so close to Am Yisrael. Certainly that was the case immediately after October 7th. Everybody had, if not a direct connection, 1 or 2 degrees removed, and it was through social media that people were able to process things in the subsequent days and weeks. But it also can lead to information overload, and it can lead to being paralyzed by grief, and so that you're not able to, either it causes so many emotions that you shut down all your emotions in order to self-regulate, or it means that you aren't able to focus on actually taking action in a way to help people. I think that's always been the case. I think this is an example of something like that, but I think the modern age has certainly exacerbated it. Yeah. I think we can see from this story that there is a lot of purposes towards the crying that we're going to read about in Eicha. But I think what's interesting here is that, at least in this verse, the crying is coming from human beings, right? It's people in Eicha the city of Jerusalem, we can sort of understand that to be, it's obviously the city isn't crying, it's the people in the city that's crying. And then we have Rabban Gamliel, who is crying with his neighbor. But there's one other crier that we have to think about when we're thinking about Tisha B'Av, and that is God. That God is also crying, or may also be crying. If you turn to the second page of the packet, you can see a reading from the book of Jeremiah. So this is from the directly attributed prophecy of Jeremiah, who also is connected to Eicha. And we believe that he's writing about the same thing, the destruction of Jerusalem. But he, in this verse, is speaking from God's perspective. This is in the warning phase, the pre-disaster phase. If you, the Jewish people, will not give heed, my inmost self must weep because of your pride. My eye must stream and flow with copious tears, because God's flock is taken captive, will be taken captive. So we see from this sort of warning from God, but it's sort of past tense, but also sort of future tense. From this we can learn that God is crying because of the destruction of Jerusalem, because of the dispersal of the Jewish people. Of course, it's always tricky when we're talking about a God who is beyond our comprehension to attribute any particular feelings, because our human understanding of feelings are inherently limited by the limits of human beings. So I guess I'll ask, is this an appropriate metaphor to be using? Does this square with people, that God can cry, or does cry, or has cried? Yeah, please.
We're only capable of seeing God in anthropomorphic terms, and therefore this is the best we can do. We can't conceive of a God what God really is, and since we're people, we can only get to think of him in anthropomorphic terms.
Right. All prophecy, and indeed all human experience, is mediated through our eyes and through our limitations. And so, if it's kosher to talk about the hand of God taking us out of Egypt, it's just as acceptable to talk about God's, during time of redemption, it's just as acceptable to talk about God's tears during our time of grief and devastation. Of course, this does cause problems with some rabbis that we'll read about from this section of the Talmud in Chagiga that say, well, God, who is all powerful and mighty, even if you attribute certain emotions to God, maybe you shouldn't attribute sadness and crying to God. We have this verse in the, fifth box from Chronicles that, glory and majesty are before God, and strength and joy are in God's place. If God is so glorious and majestic and, king-like, how can God be reduced by anything to sadness? And the answer that the Talmud gives is that this is not difficult, that when God is crying, it's in God's inner chambers, and when God's not crying, it's in God's outer chambers, like of sort of the royal palace, so to speak, of wherever it is that God lives. That maybe, what we want to see is God being, God the Redeemer, and God the powerful, maybe even God the warrior. But once God has a little bit more privacy, that's when God too is able to let go of the barriers and feel the feelings that God has. And in fact, other rabbis go on to say that for the destruction of the temple, even publicly, so to speak, even in the outer chamber, God was crying. I think that's a good lesson to take away, is that when we want to feel in all of our holidays, we want to feel not only close to the Jewish people, not only the Jewish people who are physically with us in the synagogue, but also all the Jewish people all over the world who are reading the same text as us and optimally going through the same feelings as us. This communal aspect is so important and restorative, particularly when we're united in grief and united in a shared commitment to support each other. But just as important, I think, is remembering our connection to God in these moments, or at least feeling supported by God. And that support can sometimes come from when we feel a sense of strength where we didn't know that we had it personally. But sometimes that support, just as our support for other people can sometimes be in our strength for them, and sometimes can be in our sitting with them and crying with them, so too with God. Sometimes we can feel supported by God by feeling uplifted, and sometimes we can feel supported in knowing, at least if nothing else, that God is crying with us. I think it's important on Tisha B'Av to remember that there are no feelings that are inaccessible to God, and that there should be no feelings that are totally inaccessible to us. We know from the story of Rabban Gamliel that maybe there are certain times and certain places, but now on Tisha B'Av, I encourage you all to consider this time and this place as a time and place to sit and cry and grieve with God and with the Jewish people. Erev Tov, everybody.
Yasher Koach to Rabbi Pink. I think it gave us a lot to think about this evening. So we're transitioning from Shabbat into Tisha B'Av. You can see it's dark outside, and so we're making that transition, and we'll make that transition with Mariv. And this is a time to put yourself in that emotional space, right? Use the text that we just read about crying. I love that we just gave some examples from modern day, not just examples about the temple being destroyed, though if we can really put ourselves in the shoes of what it would mean to be a temple era Jew, we could understand why that would be absolutely just so tragic. But Tisha B'Av is about all of the tragedies that have befallen the Jewish people, and unfortunately, we are living in a time now where we don't have to use our imagination to think about the tragedies befalling the Jewish people. We can really actually put ourselves in the here and now. So take a moment and get yourself there. Think about where we are as a Jewish people. And there are, this is not to say that we are only in a bad place as Jewish people, but on Tisha B'Av, where's the heaviness? Where can we sink into? This is a moment to get into that space. So let's take a moment. You can close your eyes if you want. Take a moment to get into that headspace. And then when we're ready, we'll begin Mariv. We're going to begin Mariv now. We have, if everyone has a book, if not, we'll make sure we pass some more out. We invite you to rise in body or in spirit. We're on page 18 for the evening service for Tisha B'Av.
והוא רחום יכפר עוון ולא ישחית, והרבה להשיב אפו ולא יאיר כל חמתו. אדוני הושיע המלך יעננו ויום קורנו. ברכו את אדוני המבורך. Baruch Adonai Hamvorach Le'olam Vaed. You may be seated. Baruch Adonai. El Chai V'Kayam Tamid Yimloch Aleinu Le'olam Vaed. Baruch Ata Adonai Hama'ariv Arafim. Ahavat Olam Beit Yisrael. ואהבתך אל תסיר ממנו, לעולמים. ברוך אתה אדוני, אוהב עמו ישראל. שמע ישראל, אדוני אלוהינו, אדוני אחד. Adonai Elohechem emet. We're on page 22. Emet v'emunah kol sod v'kem. ומלכותו ברצון קיבלו עליהם משה ובני ישראל. לך אנו שירה בשמחה רבה ואמרו כולם מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נדר בקודש נורא תהילות אוסף אלה. מלכותך ובניך בוקע ים לפני משה, זה עלינו ואמרו אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר כי פדה אדוני את יעקב וגואלו מיד חזק ממנו. ברוך אתה אדוני כל ישראל השכיבנו אדוני אלוהינו. ושמור צאתנו ובואנו לחיים ושלום מעתה ועד עולם. ברוך אתה אדוני שומר עמו ישראל לעד. ברוך אדוני לעולם אמן. כי אין לנו מלך אלא אתה. ברוך אתה אדוני המלך בכבודו, תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד ועל כל מעשיו. We'll continue on with the Chatzi Kaddish on page 26. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה בעלמא דברי חירותי, וימליך מלכותי בחייכון וביומכון ובחייתך בית ישראל בגולה יהי שמי רבה מברך, לעולם ולעולמי עמיה יתברך, יתברך וישתבח, ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתהלל ויתהלל, שמי דקודשה בריחו לילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה תמירן בעלמה ואמרו amen, amen. We'll continue on with the silent Amidah. I invite you to rise in body or spirit. We're on page 28. Once you have concluded your private prayers, you may take a seat. יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל. יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל. We'll continue on with Kaddish Shalem on page 40. יתגדל ויקרא שמי רבה, בעלמא דברה קירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומכון ובחייתך בית ישראל, בגלה בזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם עולם עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשא בריחו. לעילה מכל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה תאמרן בעלמא ואמרו אמן. תתקבל צלותיכון ובאותיכון דכל ישראל, כרם אבוהון דיבי שמיה ואמרו אמן. יהי שלום רבה מן שמיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן.
How does a king of flesh and blood mourn? This is the question posed by God in Pesikta de Rav Kahana, a collection of midrash from the time of the Talmud. Rabbi Pink introduced us earlier to this idea that God can mourn, as well as to the question, how can God weep if God does not have a body? And it seems from this midrash, more or less contemporaneous with the text that Rabbi Pink shared, it seems like God actually doesn't know the answer either. And so this midrash imagines that God, like the Jewish people, is overcome with grief at the destruction of the temple. Not knowing how to navigate his loss alone, God asks the angels, his divine messengers on earth, how does a king of flesh and blood mourn? God asks over and over, and in every answer, the angels reveal yet another way that humans, and particularly Jews, embody their grief. And each time God finds a divine parallel, passable despite God's lack of a human body. Humans in mourning don sackcloth, and so God will clothe the skies in darkness. Humans extinguish their lights, so God will dampen the sun, moon, and stars. Humans sit and weep, but God can't, or at least God can't in the same way we do. God has no peers, no community with whom to grieve, no friends and family to come over to the house for Shiva. And so despite God's best efforts, God can't quite manage to mourn. And so if God doesn't know how to mourn, if God, who knows everything, does not know how to mourn, if God has to learn from us and from our practices how to express grief, well, then that means that mourning is inherently a human act. And yet, as humans, we avoid grief. That makes sense. Research shows time and again that bereavement is the most stressful thing that a human can undergo. And of course, it's only natural evolutionarily that we would feel a drive to avoid stress, to avoid pain, and to avoid sadness. But perhaps in a way, counter to those instincts, we can understand that just because grief hurts does not necessarily mean it's bad. Grief at its core is not an expression of pain, but rather an expression of love. God has no need for grief other than expressing love for and devotion to God's people. In a moment, we're going to read the book of Eicha, the book of Lamentations, which mourns the destruction of the first temple and the exile of the Judeans from the land of Israel in the 6th century. In our Midrash, it is Eicha that spurs God to want to learn how to mourn, that spurs God to want to learn how to mourn in order to mourn with us. And as has been mentioned a couple of times tonight, as a community, we have spent the past 22 months in a state of perpetual mourning. You know as well as I do that grief has been exhausting. Do we really need Tisha B'Av this year of all years to introduce more grief into our lives? Do we really need to go out of our way to cultivate a sense of sadness over something that happened thousands of years ago, when there is so much that naturally sparks that sadness today? Pesikta de Rav Kahana suggests that the answer is yes. If God thinks that mourning is so important that it is a skill to be cultivated, we too must find such value in mourning. As we listen to Eicha, I invite you to find a way to lean into the tragedy of the story. Perhaps you will close your eyes and listen to the heartbreaking tunes of the trope unique to Tisha B'Av as our laners chant the Hebrew from the book. Perhaps you will follow along in English, reading the details of the Judean suffering 2,500 years ago. Or perhaps you will simply take this moment to remember that while your heartbreak might feel earth-shattering, our people have persevered through thousands of years of that same feeling. And so I wish you a meaningful and a mournful Tisha B'Av.
Yasher Koach. If you haven't yet met our fabulous new rabbinic intern, Claire Davidson-Bruder, now you have. We're going to take a moment now to get ourselves ready for Eicha. So it's traditional for those who can and want to sit on the floor to listen to the book of Eicha being read. So for those who want to, please feel free to come up. You can sit on the floor up here. You can sit on the bima. But there's no pressure. It's also fine to stay seated in a chair. And then you can just come on up so we can be a little bit closer in as a community when we read.
And if you are reading Eicha, please come sit on the stairs.
You can follow along. Eicha chapter 1 begins on page 48.
Eicha yashva badad ha'ir rabatiyam hayita ke'almana rabati v'gayim sarati bamdinot hayita lamas b'chotiv ke balayla v'dimata alecheya ein la menachem mikol haveha koreha bagduva hayula le'ayvim galata Yehuda meoni umerov avoda hi yashva v'gayim lo matza manoach korot fe'ashiguha בין המצרים, דרכי ציון אבלות, מבלי באי מועד, כל שעריה שוממים, כהניה ננחים, בתולותיה נוגות בהימהר לה. היו תוריה לראש אויביה שלום, כי אדוני הוגה על רוב פשעיה, עולליה הלכו שבי לפני צור, ויצר מבת ציון כל הדרה. היו שריה, כי איילים לא מצאו מרעה, וילכו ולא כוח לפני רודף. זכרה ירושלים ימי עניה ומרודיה, כל מחמודיה אשר היו מימי קדם, בנפול עמה ביד צר, ואין עוזר לה, ראו הצרים, צחקו על משפטיה, חטא חטאה ירושלים, על כן נדחייתה. כל ממחדיה הזילוה, כי ראו ערוותה, גם היא ננחה ותשב אחר. טומאתה בשוליה, לא זכרה אחריתה, ותרד פלאים, אין מנחם לה. ראה אדוני את עני, כי הגדיל אויב. ידו פרצה על כל מחמדיה, כי ראתה גויים באו מקדשה, אשר צוויתה לא יבואו בקהל לך. כל המננחים מבקשים לכם, נתנו מחמדיהם, ביוכל להשיב נפש. ראה אדוני והביטה, כי הייתי זוללה. לא עליכם כל עוברי דרך, הביטו וראו. אם יש מחוב כמחובי, אשר עולה לי, אשר הוגה אדוני ביום חרון אפו. ממרום שלח את מעצמותי בירדנה, פרס רשת לרגלי, השיבני אחור, נתנני שוממה, כל היום דבר, נזכד all פשעי בידו. ישתרגו, עלו על צווארי, הכשיל כוחי. נתנני אדוני בידי לאוכל קום. סלה כל אבירי אדוני בקרבי, קרא לי מועד לשבור בחורי. גת דרך אדוני לבתולת בת יהודה. הללה אני בוכייה, Eini yordor mayim ki rochak mimeni menachem meshiv nafshi hayu vonai shomemim ki gavar oyev Persat Sion biadeha Emenachem la Tziva Adonai LeYaakov Sibivav Tzarav Hayita Yerushalayim Linida Beinehem Tzadiku Adonai Kifu Mariti Shimuna Kamim Uru Machovi Betulotai Uvachurai Alchu Vashevi Karati Lamavai Hemarimuni Koanaius Kenai Bior Givau Kivikshu Ochel Lamo Veyashibu et Nafsham Rei Adonai Kitzali Me'ai Hamaru Nefak Libi Bikirbi Kimaro Mariti Michut Shechla Kerev Babayit Kamavet Shamu ki nenechani ein menachem li kol oivai shamu ra'iti sasu ki ata asita hevetayam karata v'yuchamoni tavo Korata lefanecha v'yolelamo kasher olalta lial kol pishai ki rabot anchotai b'libi davai.
Chapter 2 can be found on page 54.
Echa Yahiv Bapo Adonai et Batzion Ishlich Mishamayim Eretz Tiferet Yisrael V'lo Zachor Adom Raglav B'yom Apo Bila Adonai V'lo Chamal Et kol neot Yaakov aras bevrato mivtzerei vat Yehuda higia la'aretz chilel mamlecha v'sareha gada b'chariav kol kereng Yisrael Heshiv achor Yemino mipnei oyev Vayvar b'Yakov ke'esh lehava achlas aviv Darach kashto goyev Nitzav yemino ketzar Vayarok kol machmadei ayin bohel batzion shafach ka'esh chamato Haya Adonai koyev bila Yisrael bila kol armenoteha shichet mivtzarav Vayerev bevat Yehuda ta'aniyah ve'aniyah Vayachmos kagan suko shichet moado Shikach Adonai b'tzion moed v'shabbat Vainat b'zama po melech v'chohen. Zanach Adonai mizbecho ni'er mikdasho. Hiskir b'yado yev chomot armenoteha. Kol natnu b'veit Adonai k'yom moed. Chashav Adonai lahashchit chomahat bat Zion. Natakav lo eshiv yado mi baleha. Vayev al chel v'choma yachdav lalu. Tavu va'aretz shareha ibad v'shibar bericheha. Malka v'sareha v'goyim ein Torah gam nevieha lo matzu chazon me'Adonai. Yeshvu la'aretz yidmo Signei Vatzion, Elu Afar al Rosham, Chagru Sakim, Horidu La'aretz Roshan, Butulot Yerushalayim, Kalu Vadmaot Einai, Chomamru me'ai, nishpach la'aretz kavedi, al shever bat ami, be'atei folel v'yonek, birchovot kiryah, le'imotam yomeru, aye dagan v'yayin, Behitat fam kechala birchovot ir Bihishtapech nafsham alchek imotam ma'adiek ma'adamelach Habat Yerushalayim ma'ashvelach Vanachamech v'tulat bat Zion ki gadol kayam shivrech mir palach neviayich chazulach shavotafel v'lo gilu al avonech lahashiv shivitech vayechezu lach masot shav umaduchim Safaku alayich kapayim koivrei derech sharku vayaniu rosham albat Yerushalayim Hazot ha'ir sheyomeru kalilad yofi masos l'chol ha'aretz Patzu alayich pihem kol hoyevayich sharaku vayacharku shehem amru bilanu ach ze hayom shekivinu matzanu ra'inu asa Adonai asher zamam bitza emrato asher tziva miyemei kedem aras v'lo chamal v'yisama alayich oyev herim keren tzarayich tza'ak libam El Adonai chomad bat Zion הורידי חנכה על דמעה, יומם ולילה, אל תתני פוקת לך, אל תדום בת עינך, קומי רוני ולילה, לראש השמורות, שפכי מים ליבך, נוכח פני אדוני, שאי אליו כפייך. all nefesh olalaiich atufim berav, berosh kol chutzot. Re'eh Adonai v'habita lemi olal tako. Im tochal na nashim piryam olalei tipuchim. Im yehareg b'mikdash Adonai kohen v'navi. Shachvu la'aretz chutzot nahar v'zakein, betulotai uvachurai naflu v'charev, haragata b'yom ha'pecha, tafachta lo chamalta, tikra chayom moed megurai, misaviv velo haya bayom Adonai palit v'sarid asher tipachti v'ribiti oyevi chilam.
Chapter 3 can be found on page 62. Ani hagever ra'oni beshevet evrato, oti nahag vayolach choshech velo or, ach biyeshuv yafoch yado kol hayom. Bila v'sari ve'ori shibar atzmotai, bana alai vayakaf rosh utla'ah. במחשכים הושיבני כמתי עולם. גדר בדי ולא אצא, הכביד נחשתי, גם כי אזעק ואשבע, סתם תפילתי. גדר דרכי, בגזית נתיבותי איבה. טוב עורב הוא לי אריב, בסמטרים, דרכי סורר, ויפשחני, שמני שומם, דרך קשתו, ויציבני כמטרה לחץ. הביא בכליותי בני אשפתו, הייתי שחוק לכל עמי נגינתם כל היום. השביעני במרורים הרבני לענה, ויגרס בחצץ שני, הכפישני באפר, ותזנח משלום נפשי נשיתי טובה, ואומר עבד נצחי ותאכלתי מאדוני. זכרוני ומרודי לענה בראש, זכור תזכור ותשיח עלי נפשי, זאת אשיב על ליבי על כן אוכיל. חסדי אדוני כי לא תמנו, כי לא חלו רחמך, חדשים לבקרים רבה אמונתך. חלקי אדוני אמרה נפשי על כן אוכילו. טוב אדוני לקובב לנפש תדרשנו, טוב היחיל ודומם לתשועת אדוני, טוב לגבר כי שאול בנעוריו. ישב בדד וידום כי נטל עליו, ייתן באפר פיהו, אולי יש תקווה, ייתן מכהו לכי, יספה בחרפה. כי לא יזנח לעולם אדוני, כי אם הוגה בריחה מקרוב חסדיו, כי לא ינע מליבו ויגע בני איש. לדכא תחת רגליו כל אסירי ארץ, להטות משפט גבר נגד פני עליון, לעוות אדם בריבו אדוני לא ראה. מי זה אמר ותהי אדוני לא ציווה, מפי עליון לא תצא הרעות והטוב. מה יתאונן אדם חי גבר על חטאיו. נחפשה דרכינו ונחקורה ונשובה עד אדוני. נישא לבבינו על כפיים אל בשמיים. אנחנו פשענו ומרינו אתה לא סלחת. שקותה באף ותרדפנו הרגת לא חמלת. שקותה וענן לך מעבור תפילה. שחי ומאוס תשימנו בקרב העמים. פצו עלינו פיהם כל אויבינו, פחד ופחד היה לנו השת והשבר. פלגי מים תרד עיני על שבר בת עמי. עיני נגרע ולא תדמה מעין הפוגות, עד ישקיף וירא אדוני משמיים. עיני עוללה לנפשי מכל בנות עירי. צוד צדוני כציפור אויבי חינם, צמתו ובור חיי וידו אבן בי. צפו מים על ראשי אמרתי נגזרתי. קראתי שמך אדוני מבור תחתיות. קולי שמעת אל תעלם, אוזנך לרווחתי לשבתי. קרבת ביום אקראך, אמרת אל תירא. רבת אדוני ריבי נפשי גאלת חיי. ראית אדוני עבדתי שופטה משפטי. ראית כל נקמתם כל מחשבותם לי. שמעת חרפתם אדוני כל מחשבותם עלי. שפתי קמי והגיונם עלי כל היום. שבתם וקימתם הביתה אני מנגינתם. תשיב להם גמול אדוני כמעשה ידיהם. תיתן להם מגינת לב תעלתך להם. תרדוף באף ותשמידם מתחת שמי אדוני.
Chapter 4 can be found on page 72.
יוהם זהב, ישנה הקסם הטוב, תשתפכנה אבני קודש, בראש כל חוצות. בני ציון היקרים, המסולאים בפז, אחד נחשבו לבני חרס, מעשה ידי יוצר. גם תנים חולצו שד, העניקו גוריהן. בסמי לחזור קיינים במדבר, דבק לשון יונק, אל חיכו בצמא. עוללים שאלו לחם, פורס אין להם. האוכלים למדענים, נשמו בחוצות. אמונים עלי תולה, חיבקו אשפתות. ויגדל עוון בת עמי, מחטאת סדום. הפוכה כמו רגע, ולא חלובה ידיים. זעקו נזיריה משלג, צחו מחלב. אדמו עצם מפנינים, ספיר גזרתם. חשק משחור תארם, לא נקרו בחוצות. צפת אורם על עצמם, יבש היחוות. טובים היו חללי חרב, מחללי רעב. שהם יעזובו מדוכאים, מתנובו שדי ידי. נשים רחמניות בישלו ידיהם. היו לבבות למו בשבר בת עמי. כי לאדוני את חמתו שפך ארון אפו. ויטע את אש בציון ותאכל יסודותיה. לא האמינו מלכי ארץ כל יושבי תבל. כי יבוא צר ואויב בשערי ירושלים, מחטות נביאיה, עוונות כהניה, השופכים בקרבה דם צדיקים. נעו עוברים בחוצות, נגואלו בדם, ולא יוכלו ייגעו בלבושיהם. סורו טמא קראו למו. סורו סורו אל תיגעו, כי נצו גם נעו אמרו בגויים, לא יוסיפו לגור. פני אדוני חלקם, לא יוסיף להביטם. פני כהנים לא נשאו, וזקנים לא חננו. עודנו תכלנה עינינו, אל עזרתנו הבל. בציפייתנו ציפינו, אל גוי לא יושיע. צעדו צעדינו, מלאכת ברחובותינו. קרב קיצנו, מלאו ימינו, כי בקיצנו. קלים היו רודפינו, מנשרי שמיים. על ההורים דלקונו, במדבר ארבו לנו. רוח אפינו, משיח אדוני, נלכד בשחיתותם. אשר אמרנו בצילו נחיה בגויים. סיסי ושמחי בסדום, יושבת בארץ עוז. גם עלייך תעבור כוס, תשברי ותתערי. תם עוונך בציון, לא יוסיף להגלותך. פקד עוונך בת אדום, גילה על חטאותייך. זכר אדוני מחיה לנו, הביטה וראה את חרפתנו. נחלתנו נפחה לזרים, בתינו לנחרים. יתומים היינו ועיניו, אמותינו כאלמנות. מימינו בכסף שתינו, עצנו במחיר יבואו. על צווארנו נרדפנו, יגענו ולא הונח לנו. מצרים נתנו יד, אשור לספוע לכם. אבותינו חטאו ואינם, ואנחנו עוונותיהם סבלנו. עבדים משלו בנו, פורק אין לידם. בנפשנו נביא לחמנו, מפני חרב המדבר. אורנו כתנור נחמרו, מפני זרעפות רעב. נשים בציון עינו, בתולות בערי יהודה. שרים בידם נתלו, פני זקנים לא נדרו. בחורים תיכון נשאו, ונערים בעץ כשלו. זקנים משער שבתו, בחורים מנגינתם. שבת משוש ליבנו, נפח לאבל מחולנו. נפלה עטרת ראשנו, אוי נא לנו כי חטאנו על זה. היה דווה ליבנו, על אלה חשכו עינינו. על הר ציון ששמיים, שועלים הלכו בו. אתה אדוני לעולם תשב, כיסאך לדור ודור. למה לנצח תשכחנו, תעזבנו לאורך ימים. השיבנו אדוני אליך, ונשובה, חדש ימינו כקדם. כי אם מעוז מאסתנו, קצפת עלינו עד מאוד. השיבנו אדוני אליך, ונשובה, חדש ימינו כקדם.
Yesher Koach. Thank you to everybody who read. Thank you to Mark Hirsch, to David Dane, and to Elliot Maza. Did I pronounce that right? Okay, great. And we're going to turn to page 144 and sing Eli Tzion together. Eli Tzion ve'area kemo isha betzirea vechivtu lach aguratzak al baal neurea ale armon asher nutash be'ashmatzon adarea ve'al biat mecharfeel בתוך מקדש חדריה, עלי גלות משרתאל, נעימי שיר זמריה, ועל דמם אשר שופך, כמו מימי יאוריה, עלי הגיון מחוליה, אשר דמם ועל ועד אשר שמם וביטו סנהדריה עלי זבחי תמידיה ופדיוני בכוריה ועל חילוק כלי היכל ומזבח קטוריה עלי טפי מלאכיה בני דוד גביריה ועל יופיים אשר חשך בעץ ארוך קטריה עלי כבוד אשר גלה בעת חורבן דביריה ועל לוחץ אשר לחץ ושם שקים חגוריה עלי מחץ ורוב מכות אשר הוכו נזיריה ועל ניפוץ אלי סלע אבילי בשמחת משנאה, בסוחם שבריה, ועל עינוי בני חורין, נדיביה טהוריה, עלי פשע אשר אהבת, סלול דרך אשוריה, ועל צבאות קהליה, שסופיה, אלי ציון ועריה, כמו אישה וציריה, וחיבתו לך חגורת שק על בעל נעוריה.
We turn to page 158 for the conclusion of Mariv.
ואתה קדוש יושב תהילות ישראל, וקרא זה אל זה ואמר, קדוש 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 אדוני צבאות מלוא כל הארץ כבודו. מקלים דמיונים. ברוך כבוד אדוני ממקומו. Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed. ויבטחו וחיודי שמך, כי לא עזבת דורשך אדוני. אדוני חפץ למען צדקו, יגדיל תורה ויאדיר. Page 162, Kaddish Shalem. יתגדל ויקרא שמי רבה, בעלמא דברה קירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחיי חונף יומך חי כל בית ישראל, בגלה וזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעולם ולעולמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי קודשה ברכו לעילה מכל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה זעמרן בעלמא ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו amen. I invite you to rise in body or spirit for Aleinu, page 164. Aleinu לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגורלנו ככל המונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא. שאונו תשמע ויסיידנו. ככתוב בתורתך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר, והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו
You may be seated. On the second day of Rosh Hashanah, the Haftorah also comes from Jeremiah. Its most famous section begins, Kol beRamah nishma. A voice is heard from Ramah. It's Rachel, our ancestor, crying out at the death and dispersal of her children. Rachel, another Rachel, Rachel Morpurgo, the first published Jewish woman poet, lived in 19th century Italy and was inspired by this language of despair over exile, concluding with God's promise of redemption and liberation, that she wrote one of her most famous poems. My God, my redeeming rock, look and see and listen to my voice. I will cry, I will scream, and I will beg. Save, please, have mercy on the startled people. Agree to establish my tent, because no one looks for me, no one helps me. The children will return to their borders, the joy of the world on their heads. Please relent, please, the weight of their sins. Quickly, please, raise the leaders of the people. I will not cry any longer, because there is a merciful God. Even if he is delayed, I will have hope that he will build his house with walls and fortress, and with a new song, Rachel will be gladdened. I invite everyone to rise and body your spirit for the Mourner's Kaddish, page 166. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shmei Rabbah, be'alma divra kirutei v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon uvyomechon uv'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael, ba'agala uvizman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevorach le'olam ul'olmei almayah. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shmei d'kudsha brichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata da'amiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shlama Rabbah min shemaya v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav hu yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. You may be seated. Friends, this concludes the Tisha B'Av commemorations for tonight. A reminder that we'll be back here 9 o'clock, both in person as well as live stream. So we'll see you hopefully tomorrow at 9. Tzom Kol, have an easy and meaningful fast. Have a good night.